Okay, this is chapter 2 from Identities and Inequalities, Manufacturing Difference, the social construction of race, class, gender, and sexuality. Okay, so we have to start out by talking about identity and what identity is. It's something that we're going to discuss throughout the class as we talked about how things like race, class, and gender and sexuality can be individual identities, but they can also be social institutions. So, identities in this context, we're talking about how multiple identities affect our situational perspectives. So, our understandings of the world are affected by our social locations. So, it's not enough to just look at one of those social locations, it's about the intersections between them, right? So, our world view is affected by our social location of our age, right? So you might see the world differently. You might have different perspectives on things depending on your age, right? So one example of that could be that research finds that young people are much more likely to support radical changes to alleviate catastrophic issues of climate change. I mean, age makes sense in that context, right? If you're 90 years old, how much do you care about, well, I can't say that for all old people. I'm sure some people do care about like their grandchildren and their future generations, but a lot of people kind of think, well, that's not going to affect me. So that affects their ideology, right? Or if you're a young person and you're struggling to buy a home, right? How that can affect the way that you see the world. Or if you're older and you're trying to hold on to your money, how that can affect the way you see the world, right? Another identity is gender. So our social location on the hierarchy of gender will affect how we see the world, right? Such as our social location by race or ethnicity affects the way we're treated, affects the kind of opportunities we have, and of course the way we see the world. But again, these things intersect, meaning you're not just your gender, you're not just your race, you're not just your social class, you're not just your sexuality, you're all of those things at the same time, right? So it's the way that they interact with each other that give us our true social location, right? Our true place in those social hierarchies of value. So another thing that we have to cover as well right in the beginning to kind of get to it is the basic arguments of essentialism versus constructionism. So essentialism is something I'm sure you've already heard of because it is kind of the dominant narrative or hegemonic narrative in our culture. Essentialism has a biological focus that ignores context and culture. So essentialists think that, gender is just biology, right? Or sexuality is just biology, or race is just biology. All of these things, even social class, they literally think these things are just biology. And we'll talk later about some of the ideology that formed this, such as the eugenics movement, right? Which obviously inspired Nazi Germany. So anywho, essentialism trying to boil down these ideas that there are inherent biological differences between groups, right? So constructionists challenge that. They say that context and culture matters. They say that our identities depend upon a social context, right? So what's the historical time period? That's going to affect something. So let's say you're female, right? Being a female in 2020, right, versus being a female in, 1920, very different, right? It's 100 years in 2020, the anniversary of women gaining the right to vote. So what was a woman's status in 1920? What kind of career opportunities did she have? What kind of life situation? Very different, right? So that's what constructionists argue, is that the identity depends on the social context. If you live in a culture that believes in gender equity, then people that don't just have the most dominant gender identity will also thrive. But if you live in a very structured society on these hierarchies, those opportunities may be limited, right? Such as women not being able to vote or, hold office or things like that. So also, constructionists argue that identities reflect our social rankings and power relations. So it's kind of making visible the invisible mechanisms that control kind of what access and opportunities we have in the culture. So a lot of our identities can really affect the way that people treat us, the way that they perceive us. And those things have a lot more to do with cultural values than it does with reality, right? Meaning, because you're broke, does that mean you're not as good a person? I would disagree with that, right? I would say, no, you are still a human person. You still deserve, love. You still deserve opportunities. You still deserve to have a healthy and happy life, right? But this idea that we create power structures that say, if you're wealthy, you're a good person. If you're poor, you're lazy, you're a bad person. There's a value structure attached to the hierarchies, right? The same way we do with gender. We say men are inherently better at everything. They are inherently more trustworthy, less emotional, more in control, etc. These are all just cultural narratives that justify inequality as it is in our present society, right? There's all sorts of these same essentialist arguments that tried to argue for white supremacy for generations, to say, oh, white people were biologically inherently superior, which is obviously BS. As we'll talk about later, there's more variation within a race, like when it comes to the actual structures of biology, than, between them, right? It's why when you donate blood, you don't donate to one particular racial group, right? You have a blood type. And so while biology and race and ethnicity are connected, while sexuality, all of these things, some of them do have biological components, it's no longer an argument of nature v. nurture, right? Sociologists acknowledge that obviously your biological makeup has an impact on your physiology, on basically your whole structure. But it also matters what's the context, what's the environment in which you develop as to how well you actually develop, right? So meaning you could be the smartest person ever, you could have the highest IQ, but if you live in endemic poverty, if you live in the Jim Crow South and you're a person of color who didn't get an opportunity for equal education, then it doesn't matter how smart you are, right? So that's how much the context matters. So constructionists also argue that identities tend to make us think in terms of opposites, right? We have these dualisms or these kind of bifurcated way of looking at identity, right? So most identities in our culture are structured in that kind of this or that binary way, right? So you're male or you're female. When we know biologically, there's actually much more variation in intersexuality. When it comes to gender, you're either, man or woman, which again, we know that there's much more variation there. That when it comes to race, we think of it as black or white, when ethnicity plays a strong role. And really, what does that say to someone who's mixed race, right? When all of these categories are subsumed and we just kind of construct everything as this or that. But the problem with that binary, when you do that, when you say, oh, you're either gay or you're straight, right? These kind of binaries obscure the overwhelming similarities of all people. We talked about this a little bit before, similarities and differences, right? How we focus on the difference, but we don't focus on what unites us, what makes us the same. And we don't ever acknowledge that overwhelmingly we're the same, right? So these dualities make us think of everything as binary categories. Why? Because that's easy. It's so much easier to say, okay, sex, biological category is only male or female. XX, XY, that's it. Even though we know there's variations, and we'll talk about that later as well. But it's easier to say that because it's easier to look at a person and make a snap judgment. Male, female, which of the two? When you complicate a binary, people lose their minds. Like a few years ago, I remember when Target decided to stop labeling their toy aisle as girls' toys and boys' toys. People lost their minds, right? This idea that somehow you couldn't tell what was gendered toy for a girl and what was gendered toy for a boy. And the reason that people fought for this was because they argued, a ball isn't inherently something for a boy and a doll isn't something inherent for a girl. That the value systems of being active, being able to be strong and physical, that's not gendered as male. That should just be everybody. Everyone should have those qualities. And at the same time, having a doll, being able to nurture, have compassion, that kind of sense of imagination is a positive thing for boys and for girls and for really anyone that's non-binary. So we create these dualities because it's easier to make stereotypes and snap judgments based on you're this or you're that. And something we're going to continue to talk about is how these identifiers that we make for people, these categories, these groups we kind of force people into identity-wise, have both psychological and structural meanings. So we're going to discuss that much more as we go through each one of these different identities separately, such as race and ethnicity, social class, gender, sexuality, all of these things. We're going to kind of deconstruct them individually, but it's important to understand that we have all of them at the same time, right? They intersect each other. Okay, so how do we socially construct race and ethnicity? So again, the meanings that we have about race and ethnicity are linked to a social context. That just means that they change over time and they're not rigid, right? So as we discussed previously, when people make essentialist or biological arguments about race and ethnicity, they ignore the way that the meanings of race change throughout time, right? As we're going to explore in some other readings. So these things aren't rigid. There's no kind of natural categories, right? This idea that racial categories are not natural, right? That it's something that was created for us to categorize and subjugate people, right? That there were also inherent social class and other privileges that came inherent with subjugating certain groups of people. So there's a very famous experiment that was done called the blue-eyed, brown-eye experiment, where basically the woman who created it was trying to teach young white children what it felt like to experience racism, right? Because a lot of the privilege that we'll discuss comes from the experience of actually living within a racialized body. If someone doesn't have that experience, they often can discount it and ignore it and say, well, it's not a problem to me, so it's not a problem, which is what the essence of privilege is, right? But it is a problem because if it affects anyone, it's a problem. So basically, this woman created this blue-eyed, brown-eyed experiment where she took a classroom full of children and divided them based on their eye color. And she treated all the kids with brown eyes better than the kids with blue eyes, right? And the outcome of this experiment, the whole point of the experiment, is to show that something as arbitrary as eye color is not a logical way to organize value, right? That kids feel like, hey, that's not fair. Why is it that the brown-eyed kids get something and I don't, right? Why am I being treated as inferior because of my blue eyes? And she would say things that we use against racial groups. She'd say things like, well, why don't you just, if you could just act like the brown-eyed people, then maybe you'd have those things. And so she's really kind of putting people into a situation where they have to have an experience of racial prejudice if they're white, because oftentimes people cannot make these connections without someone holding their hand and walking them through them, right? And so it's a very important experiment because it still has a lasting impact on every class that went through that, right? That oftentimes, if you're white, you have the privilege of not having to see the grim realities of race or not having to experience them. So she created this ingenious way to make sure that the children who went through that experiment would always remember what that felt like, right? But again, when we talk about racial categories being not natural, being something that are linked to the social context, we can use the census in American society as an example, meaning how we've categorized race over time has changed very dramatically, right, since the first census was taken. And the way that we define who belongs to which category has definitely changed, right? So you can look back through the census and there's time periods where if you're Hispanic, you're considered white. If you're Middle Eastern, you're considered white. If you were Asian, you're considered white. And then there's time periods where obviously that's not what's considered white as well. So it's interesting. You see that the construction of whiteness has been an ongoing project. And we'll talk about racial formation later. But it is fascinating to know, as we'll talk about through assimilation, that Eastern European immigrants that were treated with disdain and disgust when they came to the shores of America were able to, through intermarriage, become white, become accepted. Like we assume, like if we see someone who is Italian, we're not like, ew, they're biologically inferior. But that's what people actually believed, right? When the Irish came here during the Great Potato Famine, where, millions of people starved. Or for the Italians, or for other kind of Eastern European groups that did not come here with wealth, did not have that kind of privilege and power, were seen as downtrodden immigrant groups, especially Jewish immigrants, that then were able to be kind of ensconced inside of what we consider whiteness as a category once they were intermarried and more assimilated into the culture. But if you are a racial minority or an ethnic minority that's an immigrant, your skin color doesn't allow you to enter the realm of whiteness, right? So we've structured all these other categories. Why? To try to kind of distribute who should have power and who shouldn't, right? The whole creation of whiteness, as we'll discuss, has everything to do with exclusion. So also when it comes to multiracial identities, these conflict with our dualistic thinking and break down the assumptions of differences between race, right? And this is why it's so uncomfortable for a lot of people, just other people's multiracial existence, right? Like I have a friend of mine that his father is Russian and his mother's Japanese. And I've been out with him many times where people have stopped him, like random strangers, or sometimes, friends of ours or things like that in social settings, and said, quote, "What are you?" End quote, right? Something to the effect of, what am I looking at, right? Because they can't understand kind of a multiracial identity. They want to fit him in a box. They're like, well, he seems kind of white, but he's not white. He seems Asian, but he's not quite Asian. So there's this idea of like, we have to fit him in a box. But as we'll discuss with racial categories and their formation in the US, this was really mitigated around the one drop rule. Meaning if you have any racial or ethnic variation within your bloodline, then therefore you are no longer white, right? So whiteness just kind of became the absence of color. But again, it's so much more complicated than all of this. So we're going to kind of break these things down throughout the class. But again, the reason people react so negatively, and really the reason that laws literally said that different racial and ethnic groups could not marry each other or have children, was a way to reinforce the racial hierarchy of the time period, right? So obviously we have more multiracial people now, and we have more, interracial marriages now. But that's because, only a couple decades ago, it was illegal. So it makes sense that there would only be a small uptick in those marriages since that time period. So again, these categories do not reflect the way people actually experience race. And that's what's important, is that when it comes to race and ethnicity, these are experiential. These are about the ways that people talk to you, look at you, what kind of value they give to you, what kind of expectations they have about your language, your behavior, your religion, all of it. A lot of assumptions come with the stereotypes we place on race and ethnicity. Okay, so social class identities. So class identities are also very important as it affects the way that we kind of navigate the world, what we strive for, what our ultimate kind of financial value system is. And so social class is just people who share a similar economic position in society. And what's interesting about this kind of social class stuff that we'll talk about later is how even if we are at the lowest realm of the ladder, we always aspire to be the person that has the most, right? It's a central feature of our capitalism in our American society. The bootstrap myth, the rags to riches myth, it has so much to do with the way that we construct social class in America. So that's something we'll be kind of deconstructing through the class. So anyway, social class for our definition for now is just people that have the same or similar economic position, right? And so caste systems are stratification systems based on birth that limit social mobility. So a caste system is basically where you're born into a certain position and that's the one you die in. There's no way to move or change. So some people argue that social class in America is a virtual caste system because there's so few ways to achieve social mobility. Social mobility, of course, being moving up or down a social class, moving up or down the social class ladder, right? So obviously you're trying to achieve social mobility right now, right? You're following the social script of society. You get that degree, you get some more money, right? You achieve that social mobility. And we'll talk about this much more in depth later when we discuss education. But we know for a fact that not everyone has access to higher education. We know that in our culture, people have to pay for higher education, while in most developed, especially European nations, but in pretty much every developed nation except for us, college education is accessible to everyone. Anyone who wants it can get it. It's affordable or tax subsidized free. I mean, not every university. It's not like you're going to go to like Harvard for free. Those are private institutions. But within the structure of their systems, they provide for that basic social mobility. It's about who desires to go to school. But in America, the prices keep soaring. And every time there's more cuts to the budget of universities, the costs get pushed onto students themselves. So only the wealthiest students are able to navigate those problems, right? Otherwise, you're an idiot like me, you take out a bunch of loans, you pay off those loans for the rest of your damn life, right? Still living through that. Sorry, a little too fresh for me. So anyway, but it's important to note that even with those opportunities for social mobility, those are becoming more and more scarce as our economy is changing to something that is almost impossible unless you have so much capital to be able to navigate positively. So we'll talk about that much more in depth later, especially when we talk about how education affects social class, how the structure of the system of work affects us in these kind of ways. But really, the key to understand right now is that the value system in the culture says we all want to be rich. We all want to have just like a ridiculous amount of money, right? What's interesting about social class too, like I mentioned in chapter 1, is that it seems to be the most obvious hierarchy to people because it literally stratifies itself. Upper class, middle class, working class, lower class, underclass, right? That there's kind of almost a visible hierarchy of it. And so poverty is a huge issue in American society. It's just getting worse and worse as we stratify society even more, right? As billionaires take money out of our system that never gets back into it, while they pay their workers almost nothing so that they make the money off the backs of these struggling people that have no power or resources to do anything about that, right? So poverty is just defined as, poor related to the poverty line. So this is important too, because oftentimes people get into these kind of pointless debates over relative poverty versus absolute poverty, right? Absolute poverty is like you're starving in the street. You don't have clothes on your back, right? And so a lot of times when people try to discuss real issues of poverty and inequality in America, some people, especially conservatives, will point to the developing world and say, well, look, there's way more poverty there. People here have a lot of things that people in other countries that are developing don't have, like potentially clean water, which again, a lot of people in America don't have. But still, there's this idea that, well, you're not in one of those advertisements about sending $1 a day, right? So therefore, you're living it up. And there's actually this great clip I used to use from Jon Stewart before that became dinosauric, was he had this clip where Fox News was attacking programs that help support poor people, like food stamps, trying to act like literally millions of people are defrauding it. And it's just so comical. Like he could break it down and make it a joke about these arguments. But the real consequence is how many people really believe that stuff, especially when those people that believe it themselves are the ones who are making the decisions that affect everyone else's life, that affect those poor people, right? So for instance, when it comes to Congress, the overwhelming majority of congressmen and women are millionaires or richer. I mean, obviously the cabinet under the Trump administration, lots of billionaires in there. So what does that mean? It means they have literally no idea what it's like to be poor. right? Like when Trump said that, well, of course you need voter IDs because you need an ID to buy groceries. And you're like, what? That dude has never bought groceries, right? Or Steve Mnuchin, this guy who's like a crazy multi-billionaire, saying $1,200 to a family once, that's plenty. That's plenty for American families. They can pay their rent for 4 months. And you're like, how much money does he think poor people pay for rent? Like, he has literally no idea, right? But that's the power of their privilege, of being the ultra wealthy. So they don't have to care about what it's like to try to survive on, poverty wages, what it's like to try to survive when you're not getting paid a living wage, when you're doing everything society told you to do. You're working full time, you're going to college, you're doing all your things, and you still can't get anywhere. And it's not because you're lazy or you're not trying. It's because the structure of society is so slanted towards the powerful and the rich that it's almost impossible to navigate from poverty. So we're going to talk about, how did it become that way? How did this happen? And how were we so blind to it? Another important identity is gender identities. So it's important first, obviously, to kind of differentiate sex and gender, since those things are often used interchangeably but are very different. So sex is a biological marker basically connected to your genitalia or your biological distinctions, right? So often we're looking for either maleness or femaleness there, but even sex itself is not a binary, which is really fascinating. We'll talk about that in 1 second. So just put that to the side, right? Often we talk about, sex is biology, gender is social. That's the real distinction. But we'll talk about in a minute. Sex is also socially constructed. But anyway, just set that aside for a moment, right? Sex is biology. Gender is the psychological, social, and cultural aspects of being either masculine or feminine in this kind of bifurcated world we've created, right? So gender would be wearing high heels, having long hair, putting on fake lashes, right? Like things that are expected for one particular group or the other, right? Wearing muscle shirts with your arms cut out, right? Driving a raised truck. Like there's certain expectations about those things. So what we wear, what we drive, how we walk, how we talk, how we eat, how we do everything is often affected by our performance of gender, or how much we adhere to the expectations of how a woman's supposed to act versus how a man's supposed to act. And we act as if those are the only two categories of expression, which they obviously are not. So that kind of is a good transition to transgender, right? This is, again, challenging our dualistic understanding. So this is why people have such a problem with people just existing as transgender. And it's kind of interesting, especially for conservatives. They act like this just happened. Like, I'm sorry for laughing. It's not funny. It's crazy. Really, it's crazy making that people would assume that this is an identity that just happened. Like, I just heard about it, so it just happened. People have been trans for generations. It's not a new phenomenon. You can look throughout history at many people. Well, some people say, like, one of the most famous trans people is Joan of Arc, right? Who dressed as a man to lead troops. Like, it's the whole thing. It's fascinating. We don't think of it that way, right? We don't think of Joan of Arc as being like kind of a transgender, or even a type of representation of challenging those gender binaries, right? We don't think of it that way, but they thought of it that way. Meaning, how did Joan of Arc die? She was burned as a witch. Why? For getting outside of her station, for her gender, for what was expected for gender, for women at the time, right? So as much as we don't think about it now, we've changed the history past that. I mean, that's why they burned her alive. So it's interesting how people have these real conflicts or problems with people just existing as who they are. But there is this drive from a lot of people to try to force transgender people to identify with the biological sex of their birth, which is not only aggressive and hurtful, but actually affects suicidal ideation dramatically, right? Just not using someone's preferred pronoun, right? So Someone that is a trans woman, if you're referring to her as him or shim or any of these kind of derogatory, hurtful slights that again are about reinforcing a power structure, right, of cisgendered people above transgendered people. And you even have high profile people like J.K. Rowling that fire off these really ignorant things about trans people. There's like a whole word for it now of, trans exclusive radical feminists, what they call TERF, of these women that purport values of being a feminist, yet don't care about or advocate for the rights of transgender people, which is disgusting because if your feminism isn't intersectional, it's not feminism. It's just you being a jerk and you using your power to punch down at people that have less power. Because the real thing that is so fascinating, especially about gender, it affects people at their core because it's an organizing principle of society. Everything is based on this false duality, right? What kind of careers you should go into, who you marry, all of these things that are so essential to our culture are structured on this basic understanding that you're this or you're that. And once you challenge that by just existing as you are, that threatens the crap out of people. And this is also very, very frightening, especially in a time period where the consequences are incredibly real, especially for trans women of color who are being killed at epidemically high proportions, meaning it's such a small percentage of the population, like infinitesimal percentage of the population, yet dozens of people are killed, routinely. And the saddest part too is how the structure of society reinforces these killings. They justify these killings in the media. They don't call attention to how bigoted these kind of killings are. There's even legal defenses in many states saying that if you thought someone was cisgendered and then through the course of dating them or interacting with them in some way found out they were transgender and murder them, that is an excusable defense for murder, right? So you're dating someone, you go home with them, you start hooking up, and you find out this person is trans. So then you react by murdering them, and that's somehow okay because you're like, whoa, I'm so threatened. My masculinity is threatened. These things are horrific that we're still excusing away murder of any group of people. Why? Oh, because it scared me. What scares you? What scares me is challenging binaries. And you're like, what? That's so dumb. Like, that is such an inexcusable reason to murder a person. But it's happening every day, and people let it happen because they don't see transgender people as people. It's horrible. And in reality, transgender people are doing a great service for everyone because they're pointing out we all do gender, meaning we all perform our gender, right? It's a social performance. And if you don't think so, then tell, a cisgendered female to just get up and walk out the door in 5 minutes. It's funny because that's who I was when I was in college and undergrad. I would just, put on a t-shirt and jeans and go to class. But in our culture, we expect women to primp and preen, and there's stuff you gotta shave, there's stuff you gotta wax, there's stuff you gotta glue a bunch of fake crap onto your nails, onto your eyelids, put all this sparkly crap on your face, all these things to clog your pores, all these scents and things and this hair product and all this crap. Why? So that you can then be adequately female. Well, if it was just biological, then wouldn't we just be like female? You wouldn't have to glue fake eyelashes onto your eyes, right? But doing gender, performing gender has much more to do with creating a difference between men and women, right? So it has everything to do with the markers that create those differences. This is why it's kind of fascinating. When my dad was a young adult, I know, 1,000 years ago, it was a big deal that men were starting to grow their hair long, right? And people would get mocked or threatened or beat up for having long hair, right? As men, even though they were heterosexual men, they were still being targeted for the stuff like, are you a man? Are you a girl? And all of these kind of things. And it's interesting because so many men were just like, well, screw that. I'm going to have long hair. I don't care what you say about my hair. They actually created more space for men to have longer hair. It's still not like completely normative, but it's definitely not something that gets you fired from your job anymore or gets you like beaten up on the street. Not necessarily, right? Maybe it still does in some places, but the idea is that by just performing something different, like for women, entering, because of Title IX and gaining access to sports, becoming more and more athletic, like you have people like, you know, um, Serena Williams, that because there's a whole generation of women that grew up past Title IX that were allowed to be athletic, you can now see how athletic women can be and how that can still fit within the performance of female gender, right? But it's fascinating that if you legally restrict someone from being able to, like women weren't allowed to run in a marathon, women were just, there wasn't funding for female sports programs, things like that. Obviously, if you don't let women run the marathon, then you can easily say women can't run a marathon, right? So it's interesting how when we just do the things that we're told we can't do, whether it's men growing their hair long, or men wearing makeup, that's a thing that in recent years there's been a lot more pushback, and it's good. I think men should be able to express themselves. I think also in recent years men are allowed to wear more color, right? There's so many years of just grays and whites and black, like just no color in men's wardrobe. Why? Because anytime a man performs anything that's considered somewhat suspect to gender performance, they are hit with sexist slurs, right? They're hit with, you're a bitch, or any of these kind of sexist slurs that are centered on saying that a man is acting like a woman and therefore should be punished. So what are they doing? Just reinforcing the hierarchy that assumes men are above women. So if a man does something like wear a skirt, wear some makeup, he's challenging the gender hierarchy, which is why people lose their damn minds. But as a woman, I can wear pants, I can wear makeup or not wear makeup, right? I can do more masculine things without it affecting the way that people treat me in the same way, because if I'm being more masculine, I'm still not challenging the gender hierarchy that says men are above women. So it's interesting. Performing gender is all about how we act, male or female. And this is something that we're policed on. We'll talk about this with families from day one, right? Meaning I couldn't count how many times my mom told me at some point, act like a lady, cross your legs, sit up. Don't do that. That's for boys, right? And that we're trained in so many ways by our family, by our education in schools, by our peers, by our loved ones, that affects the way that we then internalize our own sense of gender and the way that we then perform it for others. The sad part is we're often rewarded the closer we stick to the dominant expectations of gender. So if you hyper-perform femininity or you hyper-perform masculinity, people like it. And again, don't take it from me, take it from my students in my gender class that I actually make them do an activity like that. And oh man, the stories that come out of it are just fascinating and horrific. I've actually unintentionally broke up some couples, but and I felt bad, but I remember a student being like, no, it's for the best. So, it's pretty fascinating when you really start looking at it as to how do you portray your gender. A lot of it has to do with those physical markers that have nothing to do with actual biological gender, like the clothes you wear, makeup, hair, things like that really don't have anything to do with some inherent biological difference. Okay, so the sexual dichotomy is like the gender dichotomy. Our entire culture is built on this concept. We divide sex into only male and female, but in reality, according to researchers like Anne Foster-Sterling, there's actually 5 biological sexes, right? But all institutions only accept male or female. And if you're like, wait, what? Did she just say 5? Yes. There's some chromosomal differences, right? And then there's also some kind of conditions that can happen that can affect people. So there's things like Klinefelter syndrome. There's, androgen sensitivity. There's, some people have chromosomal differences, like they have 2 X chromosomes and a Y chromosome, right? So the fact that we only acknowledge XX and XY means that we're really ignoring the fact that a large percentage of people are actually born intersexed. So even though there's variations in biological sex, all institutions only accept male or female. So transsexual are people who identify with a different sex than the biological one. So again, not to be confused with transgender, that's more about your gendered performance. This is what confuses a lot of people, because when it comes to being either transgender, transsexual, people are so caught up on genitals, right? When that's kind of creepy, because think about it. When it comes to gender, how do you determine someone's gender? Do you look in their pants? No, you look at their face. You look at what they're wearing. You look at how they talk and walk and all of that. You don't look in, well, hopefully, you're not just looking inside their pants. And as a result, gender's not something. So when they started trying to do those bathroom bills where they're saying, oh, only people with the biological sex of their birth certificate can use this bathroom, the reason used for it was, oh, this is going to protect women. So we'll talk about benevolent sexism later, but just that's what that is. To say, oh, we're doing it to protect women and children. But no, they're not. They're doing it to punish trans people for being trans, right? Meaning, when it comes to trans women posing a danger to women in bathrooms, there's literally no evidence of that whatsoever. But when it comes to a trans woman having to use a men's bathroom, so much violence has happened to women because of that. And even this whole thing about bathroom bills, they just act as if a cisgendered male can't just like walk into a female bathroom at any time, which actually happens all the time. And many women have been sexually assaulted, beaten, killed in bathrooms because a guy just walked into it. So this whole kind of bathroom bill thing has very little to do with protecting women and much more to do with punishing people that don't fit into a binary. So when it comes in different cultures, they have different values. And so many cultures have a third gender to deal with the complexities of either gender difference, gender performance differences, or intersexuality and the performance of dichotomies of gender performance, which are constraining to most people, right? There's almost every person can tell a time of when they felt constrained by being, like, I can't fulfill the expectations of my gender role, right? And so there are great examples all over the world of how different groups deal with these kind of complicated natures. So again, kind of pushing the constructionist argument, right? So there's the Hiras. So there's examples like the Two Spirits in Native American tribes, right, which were kind of a separate and revered group. There's a great Vice documentary on the Hiras of India, right? And again, it kind of an interesting group because while they do have a special place in society, they're still considered a marginalized group. But again, this takes us back to that essentialism versus constructionism argument. If we were born and that's what it is, and we just have some birth assignment, in that philosophy, there can be no variations and only dichotomies. But the thing is, dichotomies contradict the reality of biological variation, let alone gender expression, which is much more varied and much more personal as to how it can change. Meaning some days I feel more feminine and I want to put on a dress. And other days I'm like, I'm just wearing sweatpants. Nothing. I'm not brushing my hair, right? And that can exist in the same person. That those variations are much more complex. So we'll talk about that later as well. So when it comes to intersexuals and biological ambiguity, the assumptions underlying essentialism, that binary, they're not scientific reality because some people are not born male or female, but some variation or even sometimes with characteristics of both. So some people are born with mixed sex characteristics. Others have hormonal differences or chromosomal differences that lead to variations of male and female, like I mentioned before, Klinefelters, where people have XXY chromosomes. So there's situations that are much more complicated than the binary. And when we rush to this essentialist logic, like when the Trump administration tried to change the definition of gender to be only biological, for example, we ignore the reality and the diversity of humanity. But constructionists understand social categories are impacted by the culture. meaning it changes from culture to culture and even within one culture over time, such as the meaning of what it means to be a man is different today versus what it was 100 years ago, right? But the real problem with this is the pressure to what's called fix infants. So since we believe so firmly in the binaries, we have no ability to classify intersexed infants on birth certificates. So often doctors perform medically unnecessary surgeries on infants so they can fit into the box on the birth certificate. So think about it. What's the first thing that people ask new parents about their baby? Is it a boy or a girl? And the reality is, more people are born intersexed than are born with Down syndrome, which I'm sure you've heard of, right? But many refute even the existence of intersexed people because their philosophy on how things work, not science, not observable reality. I mean, you can literally point to a person and be like, look, proof. And they're like, no, la, 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 la. So parents feel pressured to allow these surgeries because they're told their child would struggle and would be considered a freak. So it's considered to be, oh, it's better for the child if you go through with it. There's this article that I make students read in my sexualities class about this where a doctor is quoted as saying, and it's like burned into my memory, quote, "It's easier to change the child than to change society," end quote, which is so sad and twisted, but it's haunting because that's what keeps happening. We've forced thousands of people to undergo unnecessary surgeries on their genitals, which can have all sorts of consequences and long-lasting health impacts because we don't have a box on a piece of paper to explain who they are. So recently, Colorado became the first state that will issue birth certificates as intersexed. And I know New York City does the same, but not the state. And California passed a resolution to condemn unnecessary surgeries, but they didn't ban them. They still are legal in all 50 states and happen every day. All right, another identity is sexual orientation and sexual identity. So sexual orientation refers to whom one feels erotic and romantic desire for. In both sexual orientation and identity are connected to our cultural meanings and our values, like everything else we've discussed. So saying it's socially constructed just means that our ideas about what sexual orientation is and how people are labeled and categorized are a matter of human definition that's influenced by our culture, our history, and our political processes. So heteronormativity is a fact in our culture, where heterosexuality is assumed to be normal and is taken for granted as the only mode of sexual expression. So this is reinforced for us by social institutions and social policies that abound in our culture. In a heteronormative culture like America, heterosexuals are socially privileged because their relationships and lifestyles are affirmed in every facet of the culture. So in the media, in the doctor's office, in political office, in work, in religion, and in the institutions of marriage and family. So when it comes to the closet, it's not surprising that people would try to hide a stigmatized identity. And as we'll see in a film later on in this class, before gay liberation, life was the closet. Because being openly gay or lesbian could be a literal death sentence. People were locked in mental institutions, kicked out of their families to live on the streets. It was a dark time in policing sexual expression. So in the modern era, many still live closeted in some aspects of their life in order to avoid the stigma or the maltreatment that can come with not being heterosexual. Sometimes people don't tell their families or coworkers, but some tell no one. And while this seems like a way to avoid maltreatment, the constant fear of being outed can be used as a form of social control that keeps lesbians, homosexuals, and bisexuals silent. So the chapter also explores how different people will experience the closet differently. So they explored how social class can have an impact on coming out to one's family, or how men and women can experience these things differently. So again, it's important to always look at how these things intersect and how they frame different experiences for all of us. Another thing to talk about is the complexity of sexual identity. And we'll talk about this when we read about the invention of heterosexuality and homosexuality. So, briefly here, the invention of the term homosexuality, like the earliest use of it, of the term heterosexual and homosexual, in the United States were in medical texts, differentiating homosexuality from heterosexuality. So before this term, it didn't really exist. It confounds some people because they say, oh, the Bible talks about homosexuality. But how could it? Because the term homosexual didn't exist until the late 1800s. So it might be talking about same sexuality or different status sex, but not the same way that we think of homosexuality today. It's just a different construction. So we'll talk about that later as well. So in Kinsey's research, his research was the most comprehensive study on sexuality in the US at the time, so in the 1950s, and he introduced a scale to measure a person's sexual expression. He found that on the extremes, 50% said exclusively heterosexual and 4% identified themselves as exclusively homosexual. But everybody else, so almost half the population, put themselves somewhere in the spectrum, in between, which could mean some measure of same-sex desire, some measure of same-sex contact, like that experimentation in college, right? So even in similar studies since, the researchers recognize that sexual orientation cannot be measured solely in terms of sexual activity. It also has to do with desire. And just like with gender or anything else, these things can be somewhat more fluid than we expect them to be. So even in the time period we think of as the most milquetoast, non-sexual 1950s, almost 50% of the population said, I'm not exclusively heterosexual. So that's a pretty fascinating finding that really upends a lot of these kind of assumptions that we have about sexuality.